Susan Wilcox had made up her mind at the river, standing knee-deep in the cold current of the Cimarron with her boots in one hand and her heart in pieces at her feet. And she had told Edwin Prescott that it was over, that whatever this was between them could not survive what was coming. And she had watched him ride away on that big roan horse of his without looking back even once. And then she had gone home to her farmhouse and told herself that she was better for it. And she had almost believed that when his knock came at her door, before the sun had even finished setting over the Oklahoma territory. The year was 1882, and the land around Caldwell, Kansas, where the cattle trails pressed their muddy signatures into the red earth, and where the wind never truly stopped speaking through the tall bluestem grass, was a country that did not forgive weakness and did not reward sentiment. Susan knew this better than most. She had come to the territory 3 years ago with her father, Robert Wilcox, who had dreamed of wheat fields where only sage grew, and she had buried him 18 months after their arrival on a cold November morning, when the ground was so hard that the hired man had nearly broken 3 shovels getting 6 feet down. She was 24 years old, and she had inherited 160 acres of dry-grass homestead, a mule named Clarence, a milk cow that gave barely a quart on a good day, and debts that her father had accumulated from 2 men in town who were not patient. She had also inherited, unexpectedly and against her better judgment, the persistent attention of Edwin Prescott. He was 28 years old when she first encountered him properly, though she had seen him before from a distance, the tall figure with the dark hat and the easy way he sat a horse, the kind of man who looked like he had been poured into the saddle and left to dry there. He worked cattle drives out of Texas, pushing longhorns north to the railroad stockyards, and when a drive ended, he sometimes found himself in Caldwell with money in his pocket and nowhere particular to be. He was not a rough man, though he was a hard one, in the way that the territory made men hard, like leather left too long in the sun. He had brown eyes with flecks of amber in them and hands that were calloused from rope and reins and honest work, and he had a way of listening when someone spoke to him that made a person feel as though their words actually mattered. Susan had not wanted to notice any of that. She had been too busy surviving. The first time they spoke at any length was in early April of 1882, at the general store run by a man named Hector Baum, who was round and good-natured, and who let Susan run a small account against the promise of next autumn's wheat earnings, even though Hector privately doubted there would be wheat earnings, because the drought that had settled over the southern plains that spring had already begun showing its teeth. Susan had been standing at the counter debating whether she could afford both the tin of lard and the small sack of cornmeal, and she had already decided it had to be the cornmeal because you could not eat lard alone, when a voice from behind her said, "Both," and she had turned to find Edwin Prescott setting a coin on the counter next to her hand. She had looked at the coin and then at him and then at the coin again. "I do not accept charity," she said, and her voice was steady even though her pride was not. "It is not charity," Edwin said. "It is a neighbor being neighborly. I worked with your father last fall on the fence line repair. He talked about you the whole 2 days. Said you were the stubbornest woman in the territory. I figure I owe him the courtesy of making sure his daughter eats." She had not known what to say to that. Robert Wilcox had been gone 4 months by April, and hearing a stranger talk about him so casually, as though he had just stepped out of the room, had done something complicated to her chest. She had taken the cornmeal and the lard, and she had told Edwin Prescott that she would repay the coin as soon as she was able, and he had shrugged in that loose-shouldered way of his and said that there was no hurry. That had been the beginning of it, though neither of them would have called it a beginning at the time. Susan would have called it a transaction, and Edwin would have called it nothing at all. He came around a week later to help her mend a section of fence that the winter had destroyed, and she fed him supper afterward because it was the proper thing to do. He came the week after that to look at the pump, which had been giving her trouble, and he fixed it in an hour with a replacement washer he had brought without being asked, which told her he had planned to do it before she knew she needed the help. She was not sure whether to be grateful or irritated, and she settled on both. By June, she was looking for reasons to have something ready when he might come by. By July, she was looking for reasons to ride the 2 miles to where he was staying, which was a small bunkroom at the back of a cattle operation owned by a man named Amos Caldecott, who ran a modest but respectable herd. She told herself these visits were practical. She had questions about the dry summer and what it might do to her already struggling wheat. She had concerns about the water table. These were legitimate concerns for a homesteader, and Edwin Prescott happened to know a great deal about the land. He did know a great deal about the land. But they talked about other things too, sitting on the porch of the Caldecott operation in the long evenings while the sky went from gold to rose to deep violet, and the coyotes started up their conversation in the distance. He told her about growing up in West Texas, outside a town called Marfa, where his father had run a small ranch, and his mother had grown roses in the desert by sheer force of will. He told her about the first cattle drive he had ridden at 16, about the way the Rio Grande looked at sunrise when you were young enough to think beauty was free. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about her mother who had died when Susan was 12, about the way her father had held onto hope the way other men held onto money, tight-fisted and determined. "He sounds like he was a good man," Edwin said one evening. "He was the best man I ever knew," Susan said, "and also the most impractical one. He should never have come out here. The territory ate him alive." She paused. "I think he knew it might. He came anyway." Edwin had looked at her for a long moment in the evening light. "Some things are worth the risk," he said, and she had not been entirely sure he was still talking about her father. The trouble had a name, and that name was Franklin Dodd. Franklin Dodd was one of the 2 men her father had borrowed money from, and he was the worse of the 2 by a considerable margin. He was 43 years old, and he had made himself wealthy in Caldwell through a combination of real property, cattle speculation, and a complete indifference to the troubles his practices caused other people. He had been one of the first men to push into the territory before formal homestead settlement was fully sorted, and he had established claims on water rights that gave him leverage over farmers throughout the surrounding area. He was not physically large, but he carried himself with the certainty of a man who believed the world had been arranged specifically for his benefit, and he had a way of smiling that did not reach his eyes. Robert Wilcox had borrowed $200 from Franklin Dodd at an interest rate that was legal but predatory, and when Robert died without repaying it, Dodd had added the accumulated interest to the principal and had come to Susan with the paperwork to prove it. The total now sat at $240. To someone like Franklin Dodd, that sum was a rounding error. To Susan Wilcox, alone on 160 struggling acres, it might as well have been 2,000. Dodd had come to the farm in early May, and he had been polite in the manner of men who do not need to be impolite because they have already won. He had stood in her front room with his hat in his hands and his eyes moving over everything she owned with a quiet calculation, and he had told her that he was a reasonable man and that he would accept the property as full settlement of the debt, that she could keep her personal belongings and whatever livestock she could move, and that he would give her 30 days to vacate. Susan had told him that she would have his money by the end of the season. He had smiled his flat-eyed smile and said he would give her until September, and if she did not have the full amount by September 1st, he would begin legal proceedings to recover the property, and that in the territory in 1882, legal proceedings tended to go the way of the man with the most money, which was him. She had not told Edwin about Dodd immediately. She had told herself she did not need to tell Edwin, because Edwin was not her protector or her keeper, and she was not the kind of woman who went running to a man with her troubles. She was also, she admitted to herself in honest moments, afraid that the weight of the debt would alter something between them, would make the easy thing they had built feel burdened and complicated. She wanted what they had to stay in the unmarked space it occupied, where it was not named and not promised, and therefore not at risk. She managed to keep Dodd's visit from Edwin for nearly a month. She failed in the end not because she chose to confide in him, but because he saw Dodd riding away from her farm one evening when Edwin happened to be coming up the road, and he had asked her directly who that was, and she had told him because she could not lie to him. She had discovered, when he looked at her with those amber-flecked eyes in a manner that suggested he would wait as long as it took for the truth. Edwin had listened to all of it without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "How much of the season's wheat have you projected?" "Not enough," she said. "Even if the rain comes and comes steady, I am looking at perhaps $120 in yield, and the rain has not been coming." "There are other ways to raise money," he said. "I will not sell the land," she said. "I was not going to suggest that. And I will not borrow from another man with Dodd's kind of terms." "I was not going to suggest that either." He was quiet again for a moment. "I have money put away from 3 seasons of drives, not a fortune but something." "I could, no," she said immediately. "Susan, Edwin, no. Whatever this is between us, I will not have you pay my debts. I would not be able to look you in the face after." He had looked at her for a long moment and then nodded, which was the right response, she thought, because he understood that her refusal was not stubbornness for its own sake, but a matter of who she needed to be. "Then we find another way," he said. The other way turned out to involve Hector Baum, who had more connections in the territory than anyone suspected from looking at his comfortable round face, and a cattle dealer from Wichita named Price, who came through Caldwell in July looking to contract ahead on beef. Edwin knew Price from 2 prior drives and introduced Susan to him, not as a woman in trouble, but as a sharp-minded homesteader with land positioned well near the water source and the trail. And the conversation that resulted produced a grazing lease agreement that would put $60 in Susan's pocket before September and leave her land intact. It was not the whole of what she needed, but it was a piece of it, and combined with what the wheat did manage to yield in the early cutting, it put her within striking distance. The remaining gap was $40, and Edwin filled it not by giving it to her, which she would have refused, but by spending 3 weeks through the heat of August working her fence line and repairing her outbuildings and her roof, refusing payment for the labor. And when she pointed out that this was the same as giving her money, he said that it was not the same at all, that he was doing it because he wanted to and because he could, and that she could pay him back in suppers if it bothered her conscience. And she had laughed despite herself, which was something he had a talent for, making her laugh when she least expected it and most needed it. She paid Franklin Dodd on the 28th of August, 4 days ahead of his deadline, in coin and paper notes that she had organized the night before on her kitchen table and counted 3 times to be certain. She went to his office in town alone, because she had decided she needed to do this alone, and she put the money on his desk and watched him count it. And when he looked up at her with that flat smile, she held his gaze without flinching. "You are more resourceful than your father," he said. "My father was a dreamer," she said. "I am not." She walked out of Dodd's office into the August heat and stood on the boardwalk for a moment with her eyes closed, feeling something unclench in her chest that had been tight since November, since the hard ground and the broken shovels and the end of her father's dreams in that cold Kansas earth. Then she went to find Edwin and tell him it was done, and the look on his face when she told him was one of the finest things she had ever seen. That evening they walked down to the Cimarron River, which ran through the eastern edge of her property in a shallow, reed-bordered curve that caught the sunset in its ripples and turned the water the color of hammered copper. They had walked down there before on summer evenings, but not quite like this, not with this particular quality of ease and relief between them, and they sat on the bank for a long time talking and then not talking, and at some point His hand had found hers on the grass and she had let it stay there, and neither of them had remarked on it. It was after dark when they started back to the farmhouse, and at the gate of her front yard he stopped and turned to her, and she looked up at him in the moonlight with her heart making a noise she was trying not to listen to, and he said, "Susan, I think you know how I feel about you." "I think I might," she said carefully. "I would like to say it plainly if you will let me." "I might let you," she said. "I am in love with you," he said without preamble or decoration in the direct way he did most things. "I have been for some time. I'm not asking you for anything right now. I only want you to know it." She looked at him for a long moment. The moonlight was bright enough that she could see his expression clearly, and what she saw there was the truth, which was something she had come to expect from him. She said, "I care for you a great deal, Edwin, more than I intended to." He smiled at that, and it was a real smile, not forced or cautious. "That is enough for now," he said. She had lain awake that night thinking about what enough meant, and whether she believed it, and whether he believed it. And by morning she had decided that she did not believe it entirely, but that she was willing to find out. September came and the grazing arrangement with Price's man went smoothly, and the last of the summer heat broke in a long, cool rain that came in from the northwest and turned the Cimarron high and fast for a week. Susan and Edwin found themselves in each other's company with increasing frequency and decreasing excuse, because the excuses for practical visits were running thin now that the farm was stable, and the debt was paid, and the season was winding down. And what remained when the excuses were gone was simply that they wanted to be together. He kissed her for the first time on a Wednesday in late September, standing in the kitchen of her farmhouse while she was making cornbread, and he was theoretically fixing the latch on the back door that had been sticking all month. She was not sure entirely how they got from the cornbread and the latch to standing close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her sleeve. But when he turned from the door and looked at her with that particular quality of attention he sometimes had, as though she were the only thing in the entire territory worth looking at, she had put down her spoon and turned to face him, and the rest had followed naturally. The kiss was not desperate or dramatic. It was careful and warm and tasted faintly of the coffee he had been drinking all morning, and it lasted long enough to be unambiguous about what it was. And when it was over she pressed her forehead against his shoulder for a moment and breathed, and he put his arms around her with a gentleness that made her chest hurt. "I have been wanting to do that since April," he said into her hair. "I know," she said, which was the most honest thing she could have said. They were careful with each other through October, which was a word she would have chosen carefully. Not slow, not uncertain, but careful the way you are careful with something valuable. They spent long evenings together at her kitchen table or on her porch, talking about everything and nothing, the territory and Texas and Missouri and what they believed and what they had lost and what they still wanted. He had a habit of watching her face when she talked that she found alternately flattering and unnerving, as though he were memorizing her. She had a habit of arguing with him about things she did not entirely disagree with, which he seemed to understand was how she stayed true to herself when something was pulling her off balance, and he never took it personally. There was a neighbor woman named Clara Hutchins who lived 3 miles east and who had befriended Susan in her first months in the territory. A practical and warm-hearted woman of 32 who had made the crossing from Ohio with her husband Tom and their 2 small children, and who had an unshakable belief in the fundamental rightness of 2 people being happy together if they could manage it. Clara came by one afternoon in October and found Edwin on the porch and Susan in the kitchen, and she had looked at the situation for about 4 seconds before announcing that she required tea and information, in that order. Over tea she had told Susan, with the blunt affection of a genuine friend, that it was plain to anyone with eyes that Edwin Prescott was gone on her, and that it was equally plain, though Susan was doing her best to hide it, that the feeling was mutual, and that the territory was cold in winter and life was uncertain, and a good man was not a thing to be kept at arm's length out of some misplaced principle about self-sufficiency. "I am not keeping him at arm's length," Susan said. "You are keeping him at precisely the length at which you cannot get hurt," Clara said, which was a different thing and which landed with the accuracy of something true. Susan thought about that for a long time after Clara left, and she thought about Edwin's hands and his voice, and the way he had looked at her over the coffee cup that morning with such uncomplicated warmth, and she thought about her father, who had loved her mother so completely and so recklessly that her mother's death had taken half of him with it. She thought about what it meant to love someone like that, to be made that vulnerable by another person's existence. She thought about it, and she decided that Clara was right, and that the solution was not to keep loving Edwin less, but to stop being afraid of loving him more. She told him this, or a version of it, on a Thursday evening in early November, sitting on the bank of the Cimarron in Coates now, because the autumn had turned decisive. She told him that she had been holding herself back and that she did not want to do that anymore, and he had listened with that way he had of giving his full attention, and when she was done, he had taken her face in both of his calloused hands and kissed her in the last of the autumn light with considerably more intention than the careful kiss in September. November and December passed in a warmth that had nothing to do with the weather, which was brutal. The territory's winters were not gentle. The wind came off the plains with a personal malice, driving sleet and occasional snow through every gap in every wall, and keeping livestock alive was a daily effort that left Susan exhausted each evening. Edwin helped where he could, but he had his own obligations to Amos Caldicott's operation, and the winter did not allow for the easy visiting of summer. They managed stolen hours here and there, and they exchanged letters delivered through Hector Baum when the weather made riding impossible, and Susan kept his letters in the tin box under her bed with her father's watch and her mother's ivory brooch. By January she knew, with the certainty that she knew the weather and the soil and the true north by the stars, that she was in love with Edwin Prescott with everything she had, and that this was not a temporary condition. The complication arrived in February, and its name was James Prescott. James was Edwin's younger brother, 22 years old, who rode into Caldwell on a gray horse with a split saddle skirt and more trouble than he knew what to do with. He had gotten himself into a confrontation over a card game in Dodge City, which had gone badly in the way that card games in Dodge City tended to go badly, and there were men who were looking for him who would not be satisfied with an apology. He was not, Susan gathered quickly, a bad young man, only a young man who had not yet developed the judgment to know which situations to walk away from. He had Edwin's same brown eyes but without the amber in them, and he had a way of apologizing that suggested he had been doing it his whole life. Edwin was furious with his brother in the quiet, steady way he was furious about things, which was more alarming than shouting would have been, and he spent 2 days figuring out what could be done. The solution involved getting James to Texas quietly and quickly, to their uncle's ranch outside of San Antonio, where the men from Dodge City were unlikely to follow, and it also involved Edwin riding to Dodge City himself to settle the matter face to face. Susan did not like this plan. She told Edwin so in terms that she felt were direct and measured, and she may have raised her voice once or twice, which was not her habit. Edwin listened to her objections and then told her that the alternative was his brother living as a fugitive, which was no life for anyone, and that he knew the man who was at the center of the trouble, a cattle broker named Whitfield, and that if he could speak to Whitfield directly and make good on James's debt, which was the real root of the thing, the situation could be resolved. "And if Whitfield does not want money," Susan said, "what then?" "Then I will think of something else," Edwin said, which was not the reassurance she was looking for. She was angry with him, and she was frightened, and she had not separated those two things out cleanly when he left, which meant that the last thing she said to him before he rode north was not the last thing she would have chosen to say if she had been less afraid. She had said, If you get yourself killed over your brother's foolishness, Edwin Prescott, I will never forgive you." And he had looked at her with something that was almost amusement but was also something tenderer, and he had said, "I will bear that in mind," and ridden away. He was gone for 11 days. They were the longest 11 days Susan had experienced since the days after her father died. She went about her work with a mechanical efficiency that Clara Hutchins recognized immediately as the behavior of a woman who was keeping herself together by keeping herself busy. And Clara came by 3 times that week and brought food each time, and did not say anything about Edwin that would require Susan to admit how frightened she was. He came back on a Thursday afternoon, which was not the day she had expected him, and she was at the well when she saw the roan horse on the road, and she stood with the bucket in her hand and watched him come and told herself to be dignified about this. She was not very dignified about it. She walked to the fence and met him there, and when he swung down from the horse she took hold of the front of his coat in both hands and looked at his face to make sure he was whole, and then she said, "Are you all right?" And he said, "I am fine, Susan," and she let go of his coat and stepped back and said, "Good," in a voice that was almost steady. He had settled the matter with Whitfield, who had indeed wanted money more than blood, which Edwin had suspected, and James was on his way to San Antonio. It was resolved, and Edwin was home, and Susan went inside to put coffee on and told herself that the feeling in her chest was relief, only relief, nothing more revealing than that. She was wrong about that, of course. She knew by now, most of the time, when she was wrong. Spring came early in 1883, tentatively at first, with crocuses pushing up through the frost-hard ground at the south end of Susan's farmhouse, and the Cimarron running clear and low after the winter. The territory was different in spring, softer-edged and more generous, as though it were apologizing for the winter it had put everyone through. Susan's wheat went in on schedule and the conditions were better than last year, and she allowed herself to feel cautiously hopeful about the season. Edwin had started talking, carefully and not all at once, about the future. He talked about it sideways at first, in references to things he might do if he stayed in the territory, or what good land around Caldwell was going for, or what a man could build in 10 years if he set his mind to it. Susan listened to these conversations and understood what they were really about, and she matched him in obliqueness because she was not yet ready to be direct about it, though she was getting there. The direct conversation happened in April, almost exactly a year after he had put the coin on Hector Baum's counter and changed the direction of her life. They were at the river in the late afternoon, the Cimarron running with the spring rains, willows trailing their new leaves in the current, and Edwin had been quiet for a little while in that way that meant he was assembling something he wanted to say. "I have been thinking," he said. "I have noticed," she said. "I would like to stop driving cattle," he said. "I have enough put by to make a down payment on a small operation. Caldecott has said he would sell me the eastern 40 acres if I wanted it, and that ground connects to the creek, which means water rights. I could run a small herd, build something." He paused. "I want to build something, Susan." She looked at the river for a moment. "That sounds like a solid plan," she said. "I would like to build it with you," he said, and now he was looking at her with the full weight of his attention. "If you are willing." She was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she could feel him beginning to worry, and she thought about Clara's words from October about keeping someone at arm's length, and she thought about her father's roses and her mother, and the 1,000 ways love was a risk, and the 1,000 ways it was worth it. "I am willing," she said, and she did not look away from him when she said it. He reached for her hand and held it in both of his, and she felt the roughness of his calloused palms and the warmth of them, and he said, "I want to ask you to marry me, properly, with a ring if I can find one in Caldwell that is worthy of you." He smiled slightly. "You should know that I intend to ask your opinion on the ring because I do not entirely trust my own taste in such things." She laughed at that, which was the right response, because it was funny and also because laughing was less terrifying than crying, which was what the other part of her wanted to do. "I would say yes, Edwin," she said. "Ring or no ring, I would say yes." He kissed her there by the river, with the spring light coming through the willows and the Cimarron running bright behind them. And it was the kind of kiss that was both an end and a beginning, the closing of one chapter and the opening of another. And she put her hands on his face the way he sometimes put his hands on hers, as though she were learning him by touch. They were engaged by May and married by June, in a small ceremony at the white-painted church in Caldwell that Clara Hutchins organized with military efficiency and considerable sentiment. Hector Baum attended and wept openly, which surprised everyone, and which Hector himself seemed mildly embarrassed by. Amos Caldecott attended and gave a toast that was brief and sincere. James Prescott rode up from San Antonio for the occasion, considerably more settled than he had been the previous winter, and he embraced Susan with the genuine warmth of a young man who recognized that his brother had done better than he deserved and was grateful for it. Susan wore a dress that Clara had helped her sew from fabric she had been saving, a blue that matched the Cimarron on a clear day, and she carried a small bunch of wild prairie flowers, because organized bouquets seemed unnecessary in the territory. And Edwin stood at the front of the church in a suit he had bought from the dry goods store, looking uncomfortable in a way that she found deeply endearing. Because Edwin was a man who belonged in dusty work clothes and wide open spaces, and a church suit was a foreign country to him. When he saw her come through the door, he stopped looking uncomfortable. He just looked at her with that amber-flecked attention, and she walked toward him feeling like the ground under her feet was entirely solid for the first time in years. They said their vows in the plain, honest language of the Methodist ceremony, and when it was done, and the preacher told Edwin he could kiss his bride, Edwin did so with a restraint that was clearly costing him something, which made Clara laugh out loud from the front pew. The first year of their marriage was the kind of year that builds a life. Edwin bought the 40 acres from Caldecott, and they began working both properties together, Susan's homestead and the new ground, running a modest herd of 12 cattle alongside the wheat operation. Edwin had an eye for cattle that was both instinctive and educated, and he managed the herd with the same methodical care he gave to everything. Susan managed the crops and the accounts, because she had a head for numbers that Edwin freely admitted exceeded his own, and she kept the books in a leather-bound ledger that had been her father's, and that she used now with a mix of grief and defiance, as though filling its pages with something viable was a way of continuing a conversation with him. They were not always in easy agreement. Susan was independent to the point of stubbornness by necessity and habit, and Edwin had opinions about things that he was not shy about expressing, and they argued with some regularity about matters of real substance, the management of the cattle and the timing of the wheat planting, and what to do about the ongoing tension with a neighboring farmer named Danner who had been encroaching on the eastern fence line all summer. These were not the petty arguments of unhappy people, but the productive friction of two strong-minded individuals trying to build something together, and they had learned early that they could argue fiercely over supper and find their way back to each other before dark. In the evenings, when the work was done and the oil lamp was lit, and the territory's infinite night pressed quiet against the windows, they read to each other from the small collection of books Susan had brought from Missouri, and Edwin had a fine reading voice that she could have listened to for hours, and sometimes she did not listen to the words at all but only to the voice itself, steady and warm in the lamplight. She discovered she was expecting their first child in October of 1883, which she might have thought of as frightening except that she was too happy about it to be frightened. She told Edwin at breakfast on a Tuesday morning, setting the news before him the way she set plates on the table, simply and directly. He put down his coffee cup and looked at her for a long moment with an expression that moved through surprise and something deeper, and arrived finally at a joy so unguarded that she felt her eyes go warm. He came around the table and took her hands in his and said, "Are you all right?" "I am very well," she said. "Completely, entirely well." He laughed and pulled her close, and she let him hold her in the kitchen in the morning light, his chin on top of her head and his arms firm around her. And she thought that this was what her father had been reaching for when he came to the territory with his impractical dreams, this specific quality of solidity and warmth, and that he had perhaps gotten something right after all, even if he had not lived to see it. They told Clara Hutchins that same week, and Clara's response involved both happy tears and immediate practical plans for what the spare room could be converted into, which was so entirely Clara that Susan laughed until she had to sit down. The winter of 1883 was hard in the specific way that winters in the territory were hard, relentless and gray and requiring of both patience and resources. But they were better equipped for it than Susan had been alone, and there was a quality to their evenings that was warmer than any stove could account for, the warmth of two people who had chosen each other and were content with the choosing. It was in late January that Dodd came back. She had not thought about Franklin Dodd in over a year, and the shock of seeing him through the kitchen window on a Wednesday afternoon, riding up her road with a second man she did not recognize, was considerable. She was 6 months along and moving with the careful deliberateness of a woman who was managing a significant addition to her center of gravity, and she stood at the window for a moment before Edwin came in from the barn, and she told him who was at the gate. Edwin's face went quiet in the way it went quiet when he was preparing himself for something. He said, "I will go out and speak with him." "We will both go," Susan said. He looked at her for a moment and then nodded, because he knew better than to tell her to stay inside. Dodd sat his horse and looked down at them with his flat-eyed assessment, and his smile appeared on schedule. He said that he had come as a matter of courtesy, which he thought they would appreciate, and that he wanted them to know that he had acquired a lien on the eastern 40 acres, the land they had bought from Caldecott, through a debt that Caldecott had apparently not disclosed to Edwin when the sale was made. He said this with the satisfaction of a man who had arranged exactly this outcome. Edwin said, without raising his voice, "Caldecott said nothing about a lien." Dodd said that Caldecott had perhaps forgotten, and that these things happened, and that his attorney had the paperwork in order. Susan stood beside Edwin and looked at Franklin Dodd and understood what he was doing. He had not forgiven her for paying him back, for managing to find a way when he had not thought she could, and he had been patient about it the way a man who does not need to hurry is patient, because he had resources she did not and he could afford to wait for an opportunity. The eastern 40 acres were not just additional ground, they were the water access. Without them, the herd could not be maintained. She said, "What is it you want, Mr. Dodd?" He told her. He wanted the homestead property, the original 160 acres her father had claimed, at a price that was roughly a third of its value. In exchange, he would set aside the lien on the eastern ground and they could keep the Caldecott 40. It was, he said, a generous arrangement. Edwin said no. Dodd said that his attorney would be in touch and rode away with the second man, and Susan and Edwin stood in the road and watched him go and then went back inside and sat at the kitchen table and looked at each other over the oil lamp. "He has been planning this," Susan said. "It appears so," Edwin said. He was quiet for a moment. "Caldecott would not have done this knowingly. He is not that kind of man." "I believe that too," Susan said. "But what he knew or did not know does not change the situation we are in." She folded her hands on the table. "If the lien is legitimate, we cannot ignore it." "If," Edwin said, "we need to look at what he actually has." The attorney in Caldwell was a man named Harold Vickers, who was one of 3 lawyers in town and who had a reputation for being principled in a region where that was not always the first priority of men in his profession. Edwin went to see him the following morning, and Susan, despite Edwin's concern about her traveling in her condition over frozen roads, went with him because these were her matters as much as his. What Vickers found, when he examined the documents Dodd's attorney provided, was that the lien did exist, but that it predated Caldicott's ownership of the land, having originated with a previous owner, and that there was a legal question about whether it had been properly transferred with the title. This was not a simple matter, but it was a genuine uncertainty, and Vickers believed, though he was careful about the word believed, that a challenge could be mounted. It would cost money to challenge, which they did not readily have in January, and it would take time, which Dodd's construction of the situation was designed to minimize. Dodd's offer, offensive as its terms were, did not have an expiration date that Vickers could find, which meant they were not in immediate crisis but in a sustained pressure. Edwin dealt with sustained pressure the way Susan dealt with it, by not allowing it to alter the fundamental course of what he was doing. He continued working the land and managing the herd through the winter as though the lien did not exist, because the work had to be done regardless, and he gathered money where he could find it without compromising the operation. He sold 2 of the cattle at better than expected winter prices, because a bitter cold spell had pushed other sellers out of the market, and the timing was in their favor. He wrote to his uncle in San Antonio, who sent a letter back that contained both encouragement and a modest sum that Edwin repaid. Susan insisted on this, with interest the following autumn. Vickers filed the legal challenge in March, by which time their firstborn son had arrived, a healthy boy born on the 9th of February with his father's dark hair, and an immediate and loud opinion about being born, which he expressed at length in the first minutes of his life. Susan had been attended by Clara Hutchins and the physician from town, a competent and unhurried man named Dr. Francis Elm, who had delivered half the children in Caldwell County, and Edwin had been in the next room being thoroughly useless in the way that men were useless in these situations, pacing and not pacing alternately, until Clara opened the door and told him he could come in. He had sat beside the bed and held the boy with the careful astonishment of a man who had done many difficult things, and found that this particular one was in a category of its own, and he had looked at Susan over the child's dark head with an expression that she thought she would spend the rest of her life trying to find adequate words for. They named him Robert Edwin Prescott, Robert for her father and Edwin for his, and she thought her father would have been pleased by that, would have taken it as the continuation of something. The legal matter with Dodd resolved itself by summer, through a combination of Vickers's legal argument and a piece of information that emerged when Vickers interviewed the previous owner of the land, an elderly man named Jessup who was living in retirement in Wichita, and who had records indicating that the original lien had been satisfied before his sale to Caldicott, meaning Dodd's claim had been based on a document that was technically invalid. Dodd's attorney withdrew the lien claim in June, quietly and without any acknowledgement that they had been wrong to pursue it, which was the manner in which powerful men absorbed their defeats in the territory. Franklin Dodd did not come back after that. Susan did not know whether this was because he had other projects occupying him or because he had genuinely conceded the field, and she found that she did not particularly care which it was. She was done with Franklin Dodd, and she hoped he was done with her. The summer of 1884 was the best the farm had seen. The rains came in the right proportion, enough to bring the wheat in strong but not so much as to cause the flooding that had cost other farmers along the Cimarron acres of planted ground, and Edwin's cattle were in good condition, and the market in Wichita was strong. Susan ran the accounts with the satisfaction of a woman who can see real progress in the numbers, the debt to the San Antonio uncle repaid, a small reserve built against the next bad year, the farm equipment in better repair than it had ever been. Young Robert was 6 months old and had developed specific opinions about his sleeping schedule that he communicated with considerable force, and Susan and Edwin navigated the particular exhaustion of early parenthood with the same practical partnership they applied to everything else, taking turns without keeping score, supporting each other when the long nights made everything feel harder. Edwin was a father who surprised her, though perhaps she should not have been surprised. He was patient with the baby in the same way he was patient with difficult cattle, and with the weather, and with her on the days she needed patience, which was a fundamental quality of his character rather than an effort. Clara Hutchins came for supper twice a week through the summer, and had appointed herself the unofficial godmother of Robert Prescott, a role she took seriously and with great joy. And her children played in the Prescott's yard on summer afternoons, while Susan and Clara sat on the porch and talked with the easy honesty of women who had been through enough together to be real with each other about everything. It was on one of those summer afternoons, Clara's children running through the tall grass and Robert asleep in the cradle, Edwin had built over the winter from good oak he had gotten from a sawmill man he knew in Medicine Lodge, that Clara asked Susan how it felt, the life she had now compared to the life she had arrived in the territory with. Susan thought about it for a real moment, which was the only kind of moment Clara accepted. She looked out at her land, the wheat stubble gold in the August light after the cutting, Edwin's cattle visible in the distance along the fence, the windmill turning easy in the afternoon breeze, and she thought about the woman who had stood at Hector Baum's counter in April of 1882 trying to decide between cornmeal and lard. "It feels like something I built," she said finally. "Not something that happened to me, something I made." She paused. "We made." Clara nodded as though this was exactly the right answer, which it was. The years settled into themselves in the way that good years do, each one distinct, and each one carrying forward what the previous one had built. In the autumn of 1885, Susan discovered she was expecting again, and this time the news did not surprise Edwin so much as it confirmed something he had already half known, because he had developed an attentiveness to her moods and her body that she sometimes found startling in its accuracy. He had said, 3 days before she told him, "You seem different this week," and she had told him he was imagining things, and then gone the following morning to confirm what she had already begun to suspect. Their daughter arrived in June of 1886, a girl with Susan's gray eyes and Edwin's capacity for stillness, a quietly observant baby who looked at the world with an expression of serious consideration that made Edwin call her his little assessor, which made Susan laugh every time. They named her Anna Margaret Prescott, Margaret for Clara Hutchins's mother who had died the previous winter, and whose kindness to Susan had been something she wanted to honor. Clara had wept when Susan told her the name, and then immediately begun knitting with a determination that suggested the weeping was over, and the practical world required her attention. In the spring of 1887, James Prescott came back from San Antonio, not in trouble this time but with a quiet confidence that 5 years of steady work on their uncle's ranch had built in him. He was 27 now, and had grown into himself in the way that young men sometimes do when circumstances give them both time and responsibility, and he was looking for ground of his own. Edwin helped him look, with the experienced eye of a man who had spent 5 years learning what the territory's land could give you, and what it would take back if you let it. And James settled on a claim 15 miles west of Caldwell that had a good well and access to the creek, and looked manageable for one man with intent. He was a regular fixture at Sunday suppers by that summer, and he had a particular talent for entertaining Robert, who was 4 and had inherited his mother's curiosity and his father's stubbornness, in a combination that kept both his parents on their toes. James would take Robert up on the horse in front of him and walk around the yard, while Robert gripped the saddle with the focused intensity of a small person who has decided he will absolutely master this thing. Susan watched Edwin watching this one summer evening, his brother and his son and the last of the day's light on all of them, and she came to stand beside him, and he put his arm around her without taking his eyes off the yard, and she rested her head against his shoulder, and they stood like that in the doorway of their home while the evening came in over the land. In the autumn of 1887, Hector Baum decided to retire and sell the general store, and the sale came with a small apartment above the store and a lease on the building that the new owner could either renew or let lapse. The buyer was a young couple from Illinois named the Garners, David and Miriam, who were 25 and 23 respectively, and full of the particular optimism of people who have not yet been tested by the territory. Susan and Edwin had them to supper in their first week in Caldwell, and gave them the practical education about the land and the weather and the community that Susan herself had needed, and had not always had when she arrived, because it seemed to her that this was what people in a place did for each other, or ought to do. Miriam Garner reminded Susan a little of herself at that age, not in temperament exactly, but in the quality of her determination, the way she assessed her situation and made her plans without self-pity or complaint, and Susan found herself drawn to the younger woman in the way she had been drawn to Clara, by the recognition of a fellow practical soul. Clara Hutchins had her own happy news that autumn, which was that her husband Tom had finally managed to purchase the additional 40 acres he had been coveting for 2 years from a neighbor who had given up on the territory after 3 bad seasons, and the Hutchins operation was now substantial enough to be genuinely profitable. Clara came to share this with Susan on a Tuesday morning with young Robert attached to her hand and Anna in her arms, which was her usual state when she arrived at the Prescott farm, and she and Susan celebrated with the good coffee that was kept for significant occasions. Susan Wilcox Prescott was 29 years old that autumn, and she was sitting one morning at the kitchen table with the account ledger open before her and a cup of coffee cooling at her elbow, and she was thinking about the number that represented what they had built, the healthy balance of their combined operation, the value of the land, the worth of the cattle, the future that was taking shape season by season in this red earth territory that had once seemed like it might consume her. Robert was playing on the floor nearby with the wooden horse Edwin had carved for him over the winter, and Anna was asleep in her cradle in the back room, making the small sounds of a sleeping infant. And outside the window the territory was doing what it always did in the morning, presenting itself in shades of gold and distance that never entirely lost their power to take her breath. Edwin came in from the barn stamping the mud from his boots and took off his hat and hung it on the peg and poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from her and looked at the ledger and then at her face. "Good numbers," he said. "Good numbers," she confirmed. He drank his coffee and watched her for a moment, that amber-eyed attention she had once found unnerving and had come to rely on. "You look like you are thinking about something beyond the numbers," he said. "I was thinking about this," she said, gesturing at the kitchen, the house, the window, and the land beyond it. "About how strange it is that any of this exists." She paused. "I came here to save my father's land. I was so certain I was just going to hold on and survive." "You did more than that," Edwin said. "We did more than that," she said, which was the correction that mattered. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, and she turned her palm upward and held on, and they sat in the morning kitchen with the coffee and the ledger and the sound of Robert narrating something to his wooden horse, and the territory beyond the window going about its ancient business of being vast and indifferent and occasionally magnificent, and the warmth between them was as settled and certain as the earth itself. It was in the spring of 1888 that the goodbye happened at the river, the one that changed everything, and was undone before the sun had finished setting. The morning had started badly. Susan and Edwin had argued at breakfast over a matter that was not itself significant, the question of whether to sell 2 of the steers now before the market fluctuated, or hold them through summer when prices might be better, which was a genuine disagreement about strategy, but which had expanded in the way arguments sometimes do in the compressed space of a domestic morning, until it was about something larger. About the pattern of Edwin making decisions about the cattle operation and informing Susan rather than consulting her, which was something that happened when he was tired and reverting to habits formed before her, habits of a single man making single-man decisions. She had said what she needed to say about this plainly and without softening it, because she had stopped softening things that mattered some time ago, and Edwin had heard her and had defended himself, and then had stopped defending himself, and admitted that she was right, which was one of the things she loved most about him, and which also sometimes made her slightly more annoyed because she had been prepared to argue further, and now she could not. They had not entirely repaired the morning before Edwin left to ride the fence line, and the repair had still not fully happened by midday when Susan decided she needed to walk to the river. She took this walk sometimes when she needed to think, had been taking it since the first month she lived on this land alone, before Edwin was anything to her beyond a man who put coins on counters. The Cimarron was her thinking place and had been so long before it became their place together. She walked the path through the field in the April warmth, the new green of the returning grass soft underfoot, and she sat on the bank where they had sat so many times, where he had first told her he loved her, where she had told him she was willing. The river was running well with the spring snowmelt from the north, and it caught the afternoon sun in its ripples with that copper quality it had in certain lights. She sat and she thought, and what she was thinking about was not the argument about the steers but the thing behind the argument, which was the question of how two people remained genuinely equal partners in a life and work built together when the world around them, this world of 1888 in the territory of Oklahoma, was organized along lines that made it easy to slide into old patterns if you stopped paying attention. She was thinking about how hard she worked to maintain who she was, not because Edwin diminished her. He did not. He was one of the few men she had ever known who actively did not, but because the world they lived in created a constant low-level pressure toward certain arrangements, and resisting that pressure required ongoing effort from both of them. She was deep in this thinking when she heard the horse on the path and looked up to find Edwin coming along the river bank toward her. He had seen her from the upper field and had left the fence work and come down, which told her that he had also been thinking through the morning and had arrived at the need to finish the conversation properly. He dismounted and tied the roan to a willow branch and came to sit beside her on the bank, and they were quiet for a moment in the way of two people who are deciding where to begin. "I owe you an apology," he said. "The real kind, not the kind where I acknowledge a point and consider the matter closed." "What would the real kind look like?" she asked. "It would look like me telling you that I understand what I did, which is that I treated the cattle operation as mine to manage without reference to you, and that this is wrong not because of the cattle but because we agreed when we built this together that we build it together, and I slipped out of that agreement without noticing I was slipping." He paused. "I notice now, because you told me and you were right too." She looked at the river for a moment. "I know it is not intentional," she said. "That is perhaps the most important part of my apology," he said, "that it does not need to be intentional to be something I am responsible for." She thought this was exactly right. She also thought that the fact that he understood this and could say it to her directly without evasion or wounded pride was the thing that made the argument possible to have and possible to come back from, which was how she had come to think about their arguments, not as failures but as evidence that they were both still paying attention. "The steers," she said. "What do you think we should do?" he said. "Sell one now and hold one," she said. "Split the risk." He considered this for a moment with the honest evaluation of someone who was actually thinking about it rather than simply agreeing. "That is a better plan than either of the ones I was considering," he said. "I know," she said, and the corner of her mouth moved. He reached for her hand. She let him take it. They sat by the Cimarron in the April afternoon, while the river went about its business, and the willows shifted in the light wind, and somewhere downstream a kingfisher called out its bright, sharp note. And after a while she laid her head against his shoulder, and he pressed his lips to her hair, and they stayed like that, until the angle of the light suggested the afternoon was moving along, and the children would be home from Clara's where they had spent the morning. They stood and he untied the roan, and she was going to walk back while he rode, as she had come on foot, but he stepped into the stirrup and then reached his hand down to her and said, "Ride with me," which they sometimes did when they were on their own ground and there was no one to see. Susan seated in front of him with his arm around her waist and the roan walking easy through the spring grass. She took his hand and he pulled her up, and she settled in front of him with his arm firm around her and his chest warm behind her, and the roan carried them up the bank and along the path toward the farmhouse. But as they reached the edge of the field near the house, she remembered a repair she needed to check near the south fence, a section she had asked him to look at in the morning before the argument had derailed everything, and she told him she would walk from here and go by the south fence on her way back. He nodded and helped her down from the horse, and she stood in the field and looked up at him in the early evening light with the sun beginning to drop toward the horizon. And there was a moment, standing there looking up at him on the roan with the slanted light behind him and the spring smell of the territory all around, where the ordinary weight of the day and the argument and the repaired argument and the love underneath all of it came together into something she did not have precise words for, and she said, "Go on, Edwin. I will meet you at the house." It was not a goodbye in the dramatic sense. It was the ordinary goodbye of a woman telling her husband she would see him in an hour. But something in the quality of the moment made it feel more significant than that. The solidity of him on the horse against the evening sky, the particular way the Cimarron light came up the slope from behind them, the sense of everything that had happened between them condensed into this one quiet moment by the river before they each went their separate ways to the house. He touched the brim of his hat to her in that easy cowboy way he had, the gesture that was half habit and all him, and he rode up toward the house. She walked to the south fence and looked at the repair, and it was holding well, better than she had expected, and she made a note to tell Edwin as much and perhaps phrase it in a way that suggested he had good judgment about fence repairs, which he did, and then she walked back toward the house in the last of the afternoon light. She was not yet at the back gate when she heard a horse on the road, moving faster than a walking pace, and she looked up to see Edwin coming around the long way, back down the track from the road, riding back toward the farm at a trot. She stopped walking and watched him come, puzzled, because he had been ahead of her and should have been at the house already. He saw her at the gate and turned toward her and pulled up the roan a few yards away and swung down with an urgency that made her pay attention. The sun was still above the horizon, but only just, the sky behind the farmhouse going gold and rose and the shadows long across the grass. He had a look on his face that she could not immediately categorize. Not alarm, not distress, but something that was close to both of those things and was also underneath, something entirely different. Something that was almost like the look he had had in the church in Caldwell in June of 1883, when she had come through the door in the blue dress, that look of a man who has something of great importance to say and is not sure the words are adequate to it. "I was halfway to the barn," he said, "and I thought about the way you looked standing in that field, and I thought about this morning and what I said and what I should have said, and I thought about every single morning for the last 5 years of waking up and you being there, and I could not make myself go inside without coming back." She looked at him standing in the last of the sunlight before her door with the roan blowing softly behind him, and she felt something bloom in her chest that she recognized as the particular feeling she had been carrying since April of 1882 and had learned, finally and completely, to stop being afraid of. "You came back," she said. "I will always come back," he said, as though this were an uncomplicated fact, as elementary as the Cimarron running to the Arkansas or the territory turning east toward the morning. She crossed the yard to where he stood and he opened his arms and she walked into them, and he held her there at her own gate while the sun finished its descent behind the far line of the prairie, and the first stars of the evening appeared above the Kansas sky, and the land around them settled into its evening quiet, the cattle sounds and the windmill and the creek and all of it. "The steers," she said into his shirt. "One now and one in summer," he said. "Good," she said. He laughed, low and warm against her hair, and she felt it through her whole chest. Robert appeared at the front door at that moment, 4 years old and authoritative in the manner of small children who have determined that their parents' private moments are less important than supper being ready, and announced that he was hungry, which was a statement that carried the full weight of his position on the matter. "We are coming," Susan called back to him, and she stayed exactly where she was for another moment before stepping back and looking up at Edwin's face in the evening light, his face that she knew as well as she knew her own land, the amber-flecked eyes and the lines at the corners from squinting into territory sun, and the mouth that was both serious and, when it chose to be, profoundly warm. "Come inside," she said. "Yes," he said, as though there were no other answer. The years after that were the ones Susan would think of, in later life, as the years of fullness. Not without difficulty, because the territory had not suddenly stopped being the territory, and the life they had chosen was not one of ease, but difficult in the way that good and real things are difficult, requiring and therefore meaningful. Their third child came in the spring of 1890, a boy they named Thomas, called Tommy from the first week because he had the round-faced gravity of a person who would not be diminished by a nickname. He arrived with less drama than Robert and more than Anna, which seemed consistent with his personality as it developed, moderate and cheerful and possessed of his father's easy patience, though he had his mother's gray eyes and her particular way of assessing a situation before committing to an opinion about it. James Prescott had by this point made his claim into something respectable, his 15 acres west of Caldwell grown into a working operation through 5 years of consistent effort, and the common sense that Edwin had always believed his brother possessed underneath the poor decisions of youth. James had also, in the spring of 1889, married a woman from Wichita named Helen Garrett, who was 26 and schoolteacherly in her bearing, but possessed of a dry humor that surfaced when you knew her better, and who had the good judgment to recognize that Edwin and Susan Prescott were the kind of people worth having in your life, and treated them accordingly. Helen and Susan found each other's company comfortable from early on, which was a relief to Edwin and to James both, and Sunday dinners that included both households became a regular fixture, the table loud with children and conversation, Clara Hutchins and her family sometimes joining as well, until the Prescott farmhouse on a Sunday evening contained more warmth and noise than it had ever been designed for. Hector Baum, retired, came occasionally to these dinners and sat in the good chair by the stove and watched the assembled company with an expression of satisfaction that needed no words to convey. He was 71 now and moved slowly but remained sharp, and he had a particular fondness for young Robert Prescott, who had developed at 6 years old a precocious interest in numbers that had apparently come from watching his mother run the account ledger, and who could add sums in his head that impressed even Hector, who had been adding sums in his head professionally for 40 years. In the autumn of 1891, Susan and Edwin made a decision about the farm that had been in discussion for over a year. The wheat operation had been solid, but was perpetually vulnerable to the weather in a way that made it a constant source of anxiety, while the cattle operation had become steadily more profitable as Edwin refined his management of the herd, and Susan negotiated increasingly favorable terms with buyers in Wichita. They decided to reduce the wheat acreage significantly and convert the ground to pasture, expanding the herd in stages over 3 years. It was a calculated risk that took into account market conditions and the particular capabilities of their land, and they made the decision together over 3 evenings at the kitchen table, with the ledger open between them and no part of the analysis reserved exclusively to either of them. The decision proved right, though it took 2 of the 3 planned years to confirm it, and the winter of 1892 tested it with a cattle market dip that caused a difficult 3 months and required them to sell 1 animal more than they had planned. But by the spring of 1893, the market had recovered and their herd was at the size they had projected, and the numbers in the ledger that year were the best they had ever been. Susan was 35 in 1893, and Edwin was 39, and they were both, as Clara Hutchins said at the Sunday table that summer with the frankness of a long friendship, in their prime, which Clara delivered with an emphasis that made both of them laugh and made their children look confused. The children were growing with the speed that children achieve when you are paying attention to other things, and look up to find that the small person you were carrying has somehow become a tall person who is borrowing your hat. Robert at 10 was serious and mathematical, and had taken to accompanying his father on the cattle work, with the focused application of someone who has identified what he wants to know and intends to know it thoroughly. Anna at 7 was quiet and observant, and drew pictures of the farm and the river and the sky in a way that had a quality to it beyond the ordinary children's pictures. And Edwin had gotten her a proper sketchbook from Miriam Garner's store and good pencils from Wichita, because he recognized something in what she made that he could not have named precisely, but that he took seriously. Tommy at 3 was simply himself, which was cheerful and determined and fond of anything that moved. The farm in the early 1890s was a place that visitors remembered. It had the quality of somewhere that had been built with intention and tended with care, not grand. The territory did not produce grandeur readily, but solid and warm and specific, with Susan's kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, where she grew the herbs and vegetables she had started from seeds Clara had brought from Ohio, and Edwin's careful improvements to the outbuildings over the years, and the old oak tree at the north corner that Robert had climbed since he was 5, and that Anna drew in her sketchbook in every season. On a September evening in 1893, Susan sat on the porch in the particular quality of late summer light that the territory produced in September, the kind of light that remembered summer and was beginning to prepare for autumn without having fully released either. The wheat fields were gone now, converted to pasture, and the cattle were visible in the evening light along the far fence, and the windmill turned in the evening breeze, and Edwin was coming up from the lower pasture on the roan, which was getting old now, but was still sound and still carried him with the easy authority of a horse that trusts its rider completely. She watched him come up the road toward the house, the familiar silhouette of the man she had watched approach this house 1,000 times in 10 years, and she thought about a morning in April of 1882 when a stranger had put a coin on a counter, and she had told him she did not accept charity. And she thought about the way the territory looked when you had been here long enough to stop seeing it as hostile and start seeing it as yours. Edwin unsaddled at the barn and came up to the porch and sat in the other chair, and they were quiet together in the evening in the way that they had mastered the comfortable silence of two people who had said most of what needed saying and knew how to simply be in the same space without requiring it to be filled. After a while he said, "Robert asked me today if he could start with the branding next spring." "He is 10, Susan said. "He is also Robert," Edwin said, which was a complete argument. She considered. "Yes," she said, "with supervision." "Obviously with supervision," Edwin said. She looked at him. "You were ready to say yes without asking me," she said. He was quiet for exactly the right length of time. "I thought about it," he said honestly, "and then I decided to ask you." "Good," she said. He reached over without looking and found her hand on the arm of the chair. She let him hold it and turned her gaze back to the evening land, the cattle and the fence and the windmill and the sky going rose and gold above the western horizon. "Edwin," she said, "yes. I am glad you put that coin on the counter." He was quiet for a moment. "So am I," he said, "every single day." The last years of the decade settled their family into the territory with the permanence of something deep-rooted, something that had sent roots down past the topsoil into the bedrock, too established to be easily moved by the ordinary storms of fortune. They weathered a bad season in 1895 with the reserves they had built and without panic. They weathered the Kansas fever that moved through the cattle operations in the region in 1896 without losing the core of their herd, because Edwin had implemented quarantine measures quickly, and Clara Hutchins's husband Tom, who had lost a third of his cattle, credited Edwin's quick action with preventing an even wider spread through the county. They weathered Edwin's broken arm in the summer of 1897, sustained when a young steer decided it disagreed with being handled, and during the 6 weeks he could not work properly. Susan ran the operation with the efficiency of someone who had been paying attention for 15 years and knew exactly where everything was and what everything needed, which Edwin told her from his chair on the porch during his convalescence was deeply impressive and only slightly humbling. Robert at 15 had become genuinely useful, not in the small ways of a child learning, but in the substantial ways of a young person who had learned enough to be relied upon, and he carried the weight of the summer's cattle work with his father, incapacitated with a steadiness that made both his parents look at each other across the supper table, with the particular expression of people who recognize that something significant has happened in front of them. Anna at 12 had filled 3 sketchbooks and begun a 4th, and her drawings had developed into something that even Susan, who was not given to excessive enthusiasm about things she could not entirely evaluate, could see was more than ordinary ability. Clara Hutchins had said it first and most plainly, standing in the kitchen one afternoon with one of Anna's sketches in her hand. "This child is an artist," and had said it with the authority of someone making a factual statement about the weather. Edwin had written to a woman in Wichita who gave drawing instruction, asking whether she knew of any way for a girl in Caldwell County to receive proper instruction in art, and the reply had come back with the name of a woman who visited the larger farms in the region monthly and who was prepared to add the Prescott farm to her circuit. Anna had received her first formal lesson in October of 1897 and had come in from it with such a quality of concentrated excitement that she could barely speak in full sentences, which was unusual for Anna, who was normally the most measured of the Prescott children. Tommy, at 7, was the comedian of the household, the child who had somehow synthesized his parents' seriousness and Clara Hutchins's warm humor into something entirely his own, and who regularly made the entire Sunday dinner table laugh without apparent effort. He had also shown a serious interest in the garden, Susan's kitchen garden that had grown over the years into something substantial, and he could identify every plant by name and had opinions about the composting that Susan found both impressive and occasionally difficult to argue with. Clara Hutchins, in the autumn of 1899, organized a gathering of the community's women to address the question of a proper school for the children of the region, the existing arrangement being a seasonal school in Caldwell proper that required children to travel a considerable distance and was in session for too short a period. Clara had written to the county seat and had organized a committee and had attended 3 meetings and had generally made herself the kind of necessary force that gets things done. And by the spring of 1900, there was a schoolhouse being built 4 miles east of the Prescott farm that would serve a dozen families in the area. Susan contributed to this effort both financially and organizationally, bringing to it the same practical intelligence she brought to the farm accounts, and she and Clara spent many evenings that winter at the Prescott kitchen table, working through the logistics of the school committee with the assistance of Edwin's coffee and his willingness to take the children to James and Helen's house on school committee evenings, which he did without complaint, and which both women noted and appreciated. Hector Baum died in the winter of 1900, peacefully in his own house in Caldwell, at the age of 77. He left behind a community that was materially different from the one he had arrived in, partly because of the territory becoming a state in preparation, partly because of the work of many people over many years, and partly, Susan believed, because of the specific and uncelebrated generosity of one round-faced man who had run a tab for a young woman trying to save her father's land, and had believed without saying so that she was going to find a way. She attended the funeral and sat in the church pew beside Edwin, and felt the particular grief that comes with the end of a chapter, the closing of a period that you could not have named while you were in it, but which becomes visible in its completeness only when it ends. Edwin found her hand in the pew and held it through the service, and she was grateful for the warmth of it. The new century brought changes to the territory that were visible in the pace of things, in the roads and the commerce and the conversations at Miriam Garner's store, which had expanded twice since David and Miriam had taken it over, and now stocked things that would have seemed impossible to source in Caldwell when Susan first arrived. The wire fencing that was changing the open range was not new by 1900, but it was more complete, and the cattle trails that had defined the region in the 1880s were less prominent now, the drives giving way to rail shipping. The open range that Edwin had ridden as a young man pushing longhorns north was already becoming something that would be a story you told rather than a thing you did. Edwin talked about this sometimes, not with nostalgia exactly. He was not a man who spent much time wishing he were somewhere he wasn't, but with the reflective quality of someone who had been in the middle of something historical and knew it. He had ridden drives in the 1870s and early 1880s, the Kishiom and the Western, and he had known men who were already becoming the stories the East told itself about the West, and he was precise about how much of those stories were true and how much were the elaborations of people who had not been there. He told these things to Robert and to a lesser degree to the younger children, in the evenings when the day's work was done and the oil lamp was lit, and Susan listened and heard in his voice the man he had been before she knew him, the young Texas cowboy reading the land and the weather and the cattle with a competence that had been the whole of his world, and she felt for him the particular love you feel for someone when you understand who they were becoming before they became it in front of you. Robert at 18 in 1901 was already showing Edwin's ease with cattle, and had developed in addition a head for the business side of the operation that combined his father's practical knowledge with his mother's numerical precision, in a combination that made Susan think the farm was in better hands than it had ever been, which was both a satisfied and a slightly vertiginous feeling. He had also, by 1901, developed a significant interest in a girl named Mary Alderdis, the daughter of a farmer family 7 miles north, who had dark red hair and a laugh that carried a considerable distance, and who looked at Robert with the particular expression of a woman who has taken stock of a man and approved of what she found. Susan watched Robert with Mary Alderdis at a community gathering in the fall of 1901, with the clear-eyed recognition of a woman who had been in exactly that situation 19 years earlier, standing next to a man at a general store counter, and trying to decide how she felt about the coin he had just put down. She told Edwin that evening at home, and he listened and said, "How does she strike you? She is practical and good-humored, and she does not let him take himself too seriously," Susan said, "which he needs." Edwin smiled. "Sounds familiar," he said. "I have no idea what you mean," Susan said, and he laughed and pulled her close in the kitchen, and she let herself be held in the warmth of their house that had seen so much living in it, that contained in its walls and floors the whole of what they had made together. Anna at 15 had gone beyond what her visiting instructor could teach her, and had begun corresponding with a woman in Kansas City who ran a school of art, and who had seen 2 of Anna's drawings through the instructor's recommendation, and had written a letter that Anna had read at the supper table with her voice only slightly uneven, because the letter said that she was talented in a way that was not a matter of opinion but a matter of fact, and that there was a place for her at the school if she chose to pursue it. The conversation about this had taken several evenings and had been honest and thorough. Susan had asked Anna what she wanted, genuinely asked, and had listened to the answer, which was that Anna wanted to go and was afraid to go, and knew that these 2 things were not in conflict. Edwin had told Anna that there was no version of this where they would not support her, and that the money for it existed, and she was not to consider that an obstacle, and that the territory would still be there when she wanted to come back to it. Anna had gone to Kansas City in the autumn of 1902, at 16, which was young but not unreasonably so for the period, staying with a cousin of Helen Prescott's who had a house in the city and who was glad of the company. She wrote letters twice a week, detailed and sometimes funny and always full of the visual precision that characterized everything she produced, and she came home for the winter holiday and stood in the kitchen of the farmhouse and looked at everything with the eyes of someone who has been away and is seeing home freshly, and she said, "It is different when you have been gone." "How different?" Susan asked. "Larger," Anna said. "It looks larger than I remembered. I think I had stopped seeing it." Susan thought she understood exactly what Anna meant, and she thought about April of 1882 and a woman standing in a general store and not yet knowing what she was looking at. Tommy, at 12 in 1902, had taken the kitchen garden to a scale that required his father's occasional assistance with the heavy work and his mother's organizational assistance with the planting calendar. And he had also, with considerable diplomacy for a 12-year-old, negotiated the use of 2 acres of the converted farmland for a vegetable-growing enterprise that he was running as a genuine small business, selling produce to Miriam Garner's store and to 3 other families in the area. He had his mother's head for accounts and his Uncle James's ability to talk people into things, which was a combination that showed considerable promise. Edwin Prescott, at 48 in 1902, was not a young man by the standards of the territory, which aged working men quickly, but he had aged in the way of someone who had spent their years in physical work and honest air, lean and still capable with the easy movement of a body kept in use. His hair had gone to gray at the temples, and his face had the lines of sun and weather, and he had a slight stiffness in his right shoulder in cold mornings. That was the legacy of the broken arm from 1897, but his eyes were the same amber-flecked brown that had been looking at Susan across counters and kitchen tables and river banks for 20 years. She was 44 and she had gray in her own dark hair now, and she had looked at herself in the mirror one morning and had thought, without drama, that she looked like someone who had lived fully, which seemed to her an honest and acceptable accounting. They still went to the river. Not as often as in the early years, when they had gone in the way of people who need a place apart from everything to find each other, but in the way of people who return to a beloved place by habit and by choice, who know what a place means and go there partly for itself, and partly for everything it contains in its accumulated memory. In the September of 1903, 21 years after Edwin had first put a coin on Hector Baum's counter, Susan and Edwin walked down to the Cimarron on a warm September evening, the river low and clear in the late-season quiet, the willows still holding most of their leaves in the last of the summer. They sat on the bank as they had sat 100 times, her head eventually against his shoulder and his arm around her, and the river went about its unhurried business around the bend and out of sight toward the Arkansas. "Robert is going to ask Mary Alderdus to marry him," Edwin said. "I know," Susan said. "He told me yesterday. He told you before he told me." "He asked my advice," she said, "which is different from telling." Edwin was quiet for a moment. "What did you advise him?" "I told him that if he was going to ask her, he should do it directly and without making a production of it, because Mary Alderdus is not a woman who requires a production and would likely find one suspicious." Edwin laughed. "That is the best advice anyone has ever given about proposing." "It worked when I employed something similar," she said. He looked at her. "You were not the one who proposed. I was the one who made it safe for you too," she said. He considered this. "That is accurate," he said. She smiled and looked at the river. Robert would marry Mary Alderdus, and they would begin their own life, and Robert would bring to it the same stubbornness and honesty that he had been born with, and Mary would meet it with her red-haired practicality, and it would be hard and real and good. Anna was becoming an artist in Kansas City, and would find her own way to whatever life fit her particular quality of seeing. Tommy was going to grow something, whether vegetables or land or something else entirely, with his father's patience and his mother's precision, and his own unnameable quality of good humor. James and Helen were well, and their operation was solid, and their 2 children were growing. And on Sunday evenings, the house still filled with the noise and warmth of people who had chosen to be in each other's lives. The territory was becoming Oklahoma, the statehood conversations that had been going on for years moving toward their conclusion, and the land that had once been designated for the 5 civilized tribes and then open to homesteaders in ways that were not always just. Susan had thought about this often over the years. The injustice of the displacement that had made the homesteading possible, the weight of what the land had been before the settlers came to it. The complexity of benefiting from arrangements that had caused others harm was continuing to become something new, something that held all of its history in its soil whether or not anyone chose to name it. She had tried to name it when she could, to see it clearly. It seemed to her the only honest way to live on ground that had been someone else's, to acknowledge that history directly rather than look away from it. Edwin understood this the way he understood most things that mattered to her, which was completely and without requiring her to simplify it for him. The evening was cooling toward the particular crispness of September nights in Kansas, and Susan knew they should head back to the house soon, because supper needed attending to and the cattle needed checking before dark, and the ordinary world required them as it always did. But she stayed a moment longer against Edwin's shoulder with the river moving past and the evening coming in over the land, and she thought about all of it, the coin on the counter and the debt, and the lien and the babies and the arguments and the repaired arguments, and the thousands of mornings in the kitchen, and the thousands of evenings on the porch, and the goodbye at the river that had lasted barely an hour before he came back. He always came back. He had told her he would, in the clear, simple way he said things that were true, and he had made it true every time, through 21 years of a life they had built in the specific place where her father had broken his heart and she had buried him and then refused to leave. She had not left. Neither had Edwin. They had stayed and made something from the territory's difficult ground, and the ground held all of it now, the wheat fields that had been converted to pasture, the footprints of 3 children growing through the years, the paths worn between the house and the barn and the garden and the river, the fence lines Edwin had mended and remended, the well that he had repaired in her first year with a washer he had thought to bring before she knew she needed it. That was love, she thought. Not the feeling of it only, though the feeling was real and present and had not diminished in 20 years, but if anything had deepened, the way a river deepens as it cuts through stone, but the practice of it. The washer in the pocket before the need arose, the coin on the counter, the ride back down the road before the sun had finished setting because he could not make himself go inside without coming back to say what he should have said. "We should go in," she said. "We should," he agreed, and neither of them moved for another moment. Then he stood and helped her up, and they walked back along the bank through the September evening, the path worn smooth by years of this. And at the gate of their yard, he stopped and turned to her with the amber-flecked eyes that had been watching her face for 21 years, and still watched it as though what they found there was worth paying attention to. "Susan," he said. "I know," she said. He smiled, and it was the same smile that had first caught her unaware in a store in Caldwell in the spring of 1882, the one that made her feel like the sun had shifted direction. They went inside together, into the light and warmth of the house that was theirs, and the door closed behind them on the territory's September dark, and the river kept on running, the Cimarron carrying its water toward the Arkansas and beyond in the ancient way of rivers, indifferent to the years, and the people on their banks, and carrying nevertheless everything that had happened beside it. The goodbyes and the returns and the love that had grown in the difficult ground of that red earth country into something as rooted, and as lasting as the oak at the north corner of the yard, deep-branched and steady and fully, completely home.